Haiti's murderous voodoo president, Papa Doc Duvalier. Francois Papa Doc Duvalier was one of the worst dictators both his country and the world have ever seen. During his regime, which lasted from 1957 to 1971, the nation of Haiti saw its population beaten, tortured, murdered, and starved in order to subjugate the people to Duvalier's will. Relying on an aura of mysticisms and voodooism, the dictator would claim his primary intention was to destabilize the mixed-race elite in order to promote the prosperity of the poor black majority population they dominated. In order to achieve his goals, he committed many atrocities that the rest of the world, sadly, turned a blind eye to for far too long. But who actually was Papa Doc Duvalier? Born April 14, 1907 to humble beginnings, his life would take Duvalier from the halls of medical school to the pulpits of political authority. Although politically active from a young age, Papa Doc Duvalier actually first trained to be a physician, looking to help eradicate the awful disease Dowse that was an epidemic among Haiti's black majority population. During his medical career, he spent some time working in the U.S. Army, helping to reduce the number of Dowse victims. But at the same time, Duvalier never forgot his desire to change Haiti. He wrote journals on black nationalism and the rise of the common black majority against the Europeanized elite. This and his work helping to treat Dowse endeared him to the black population and earned him the nickname Papa Doc. Perhaps seeing its advantages, he relied heavily on the nickname politically, using it to advance stories of his voodoo roots and later claims of mysticism. At Simple History, we've been working with talented artists on something truly special, a collection of official, premium wall art that captures history's most incredible characters. These aren't just amazing pieces of art, they're timeless treasures designed to inspire and spark conversations for years to come. As a thanks to you, our amazing Simple History community, we're offering an exclusive 25% off these prints. Unlike fleeting trends or short-lived crazes, these prints are designed to be timeless, a lasting treasure you'll proudly display for years to come. They're perfect for any space. Imagine them on the walls of a classroom where they'll inspire students and spark meaningful discussions. Or picture them in your home or office where they'll show off your love of history with sophistication. Don't miss your chance to own one. Click the link in the description below now. Meanwhile, Haiti's government was becoming more and more unstable until a 1950 coup replaced the sitting president, Umar, who was sympathetic to the black population, with a much less sympathetic Colonel Paul Magloire. Duvalier clearly saw the opportunity many others did, taking the time to build his political allegiance and mystic image. By 1956, Magloire was deposed, and within the next 6 months, 5 provisional governments rose and fell, and Duvalier campaigned hard to become the next leader of Haiti. By the end of the 1957 campaign, he swept the elections with 679,000 votes to just 266,000 and 9,000 respectively for his political rivals. Sadly, this was nothing short of disastrous for Haiti's future, as within months, Papa Doc's true nature became evident. Almost immediately after gaining power, Papa Doc set to oppressing his opposition by arresting over 100 political figures in the first month alone. Businesses that closed in Port-au-Prince in protest of Duvalier's ascension were looted, and soon anti-Duvalier publications and newspapers found their offices destroyed. Cleverly, Papa Doc also crafted a climate of uncertainty and instability among leaders on his own side. He continuously deposed and replaced his top military leaders in order to prevent any organized resistance or coup rhetoric, and created his own Garde Présidentielle, whose loyalty were to him, not the country of Haiti. Not unlike Hitler's Gestapo, these secret police, better known as the Tonton Macoutes, were harbingers of oppression, torture, and murder. The Tonton Macoutes was made up of the black majority population and worked to help cultivate Papa Doc's voodooist image. Their name was based on Haiti's traditional boogeyman, and they always appeared wearing dark glasses, dark clothes, and carrying bulging holsters. Altogether, they gave off a mysterious, sinister, and supernatural vibe, which played perfectly into Duvalier's own. Papa Doc would deliberately dress as the guardian of graveyards, known as Baron Samedi, a spirit that was directly linked to voodooism, something which in turn appealed to the voodoo faithful among the population. The reality of the Tonton, however, was even darker than the story of the boogeyman. Estimated to have had 25,000 members by 1959, they not only gunned down Duvalier's political rivals, but burnt people alive, executed many without trial, and even desecrated the bodies of the dead with opponents' heads set on ice and sent to the royal palace to display as a reminder of Papa Doc's hold on Haiti. They were indiscriminately violent, often sexually assaulted women without consequence, and frequently extorted and blackmailed Haitians. On other occasions, they'd even randomly string up bodies in marketplaces to show the complete freedom from law the Tonton enjoyed. Any opposition was small and quickly quashed. One of the most notable of these was a 1958 coup attempt that saw former officers, several U.S. mercenaries, and 3 ex-deputy sheriffs from the U.S. land in Haiti in an attempt to free the country from Duvalier's grip. Unfortunately, once the size of their small troop was discovered, they were mercilessly killed by Duvalier's men. A year later, Duvalier suffered a heart attack that left him incapacitated for 4 months. During this time, Barbeau, head of the Tontons, took over day-to-day running of Haiti, putting down an invasion of Cuban and exiled Haitian guerrillas and negotiating with the U.S. Unfortunately for Barbeau, in doing so, he signed his own death warrant. Upon recovering, Duvalier became increasingly suspicious of Barbeau's motives, concluding he was seeking to usurp his authority. As the leader of the all-powerful Tontons, Papa Doc recognized Barbeau's power and influence and suppressed it by calling him a traitor and imprisoning him for 18 months in the infamous Fort Dimanche, a place where some of the most notorious Tonton crimes, torture, and murders took place during Duvalier's reign. It was also in Fort Dimanche that Duvalier reportedly took pleasure in seeing atrocious acts carried out for himself. According to several accounts, Papa Doc put peepholes in torture chambers and participated in plunging men and women into baths of sulfuric acid, involving himself personally in some of the very worst forms of torture that occurred during his reign. After his release, Barbeau was thoroughly done with Duvalier's antics and actually did then launch a counter-assault on the president. In response, Duvalier spread rumors that Barbeau could appear as a great big black dog, tragically leading to their culling across Haiti. Eventually, the Tontons and military cornered Barbeau and his conspirators, putting an end to the revolt by executing them where they stood. Like any president, Papa Doc had to deal with re-election, but as per his tyrannical regime, rigged it in his favor. In 1961, he was unanimously re-elected in a campaign where he won 1.3 million votes to 0. By now, the true depths of Duvalier's delusional self-perception were fully apparent. It was in 1961 that he also ordered the construction of what he called Duvalierville, which was essentially an entire village intended to stand as a testament to his regime, to be built through forced donations by government officials. The project, however, was never completed. Over the next few years, invasions and coups continued, each one successfully put down by Duvalier and the Tontons, using his militia to massacre hundreds of families and brutally destroy communities in their rampage of terror. By 1964, Papa Doc sought to consolidate his power once and for all. After another corrupt referendum, in which there were only spaces to choose yes on the ballot, Duvalier named himself Haiti's President of Life, effectively ending the democratic farce the country still labored under. Among one of his more bizarre propagandist choices was a complete rewrite of the Lord's Prayer to be about himself, forcing school children to recite the new version. Our Doc, who art in the National Palace for life, hallowed be thy name in the present and future generations. Thy will be done at Port-au-Prince and in the provinces. Give us this day our new Haiti. You get the point. In similar fashion, Papa Doc would also claim himself to be comparable to Dessalines, de Gaulle, Lenin, Mao Zedong, and even Christ himself. He gave himself new titles such as the Apostle of National Unity and worthy heir to the founders of the Haitian nation, and the National Palace was lit up with his message, "I am the Haitian flag, one and indivisible." But despite his tyranny and even some popularity among the black majority, Duvalier's reign was not to last much longer. Suffering from ill health, on April 21, 1971, Duvalier passed away, and his son, nicknamed Baby Doc, took up his mantle. Although it's unclear precisely how many Haitians suffered under Duvalier's cruelty, which was continued with his son, estimated numbers for those killed stand between 30 to 60,000. He will forever be remembered as the Voodoo dictator that scarred both the Haitian population and any prosperity it had started to nurture. Female conscription and the hidden truth of being a woman in the North Korean military. To this day, North Korea largely remains an enigma to the outside world. Most of what we know of its country, culture, and authoritarian regime is delivered on the lips of those who have escaped, often going through harrowing trials to do so. One of the stories they tell us is of their life serving in the North Korean military, something every man and woman must do for a set number of years, as dictated by Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un. Conscription became mandatory for young, educated women in 2015. Reportedly, from 2021, it was changed from 7 years to 5 years of service. It's estimated that about 40% of women aged 18 to 25 are in the Army. According to an anonymous North Korean source, the reason for this change was the high child mortality rates and low birth rates in the country, blaming the North Korean famine of 1994 to 98 for the lack of available conscripts. The source claimed the inclusion of women was to try to boost the subsequent military shortfall. Once chosen, as with most armed forces, women conscripts have to pass a series of physical tests and medical exams. One of the main priorities is to test for potentially contagious diseases like tuberculosis or hepatitis. Since 2012, another requirement is that women must also be above 1.42 meters or 4.6 feet, although that's not strictly enforced. Not much is known about who may be exempt from this military service. However, it's speculated exceptionally gifted students may be able to avoid conscription. But even before 2015, a number of women still voluntarily signed up to the military for one specific purpose: to obtain membership into the Korean Workers' Party. Once your application was accepted, a world of new opportunities became available. Outside the military, being a member guarantees security and success in North Korea. Within the military, you received privileges like increased rations, better jobs, and higher salaries. Big draws, especially when the food rations were meager offerings of a bowl of rice and cabbage soup with some salted radish. Nowhere near enough for people who engage in strenuous physical activity daily, often in the frigid conditions of Pyongyang. A typical day in the North Korean Army is similar for men and women. Both are expected to do hard, free labor alongside their set military training, like farming and construction projects. Videos exposing the truth of military service have shown women clearing farmland and carrying heavy bundles of firewood, or even rocks on their back, the same as the men alongside them. As if that wasn't exhausting enough, women have additional duties men weren't prevailed upon to complete, as a woman's place is allegedly in the kitchen, literally being referred to as tukong unjeongsu, or cooking pot lid drivers. Typical household chores also fall to the females of the North Korean Army. While the men are elsewhere, women cook and clean for their fellow soldiers before retiring to study or rest in a room crammed with 24 other women. Each soldier received a bunk and a small set of drawers. Atop it, each should have two pictures, Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, although that may have now been updated to include the current leader, Kim Jong-un. These cramped conditions didn't help hygiene levels, and sleeping on a mattress made of rice hull meant sweat often soaked into the bedding. Adding to this discomfort, women had to contend with the lack of basic facilities in general, including minimal electricity and insufficient access to menstruation products. Until 2015, they often had to use makeshift sanitary towels fashioned from bandages. But with inadequate nutrition and the stress of military life, many women stopped menstruating altogether. Hygiene outside of the barracks was no better, with showers consisting of cold water from hoses, sometimes even with frogs or snakes coming through. This vulnerability is only exemplified by the general treatment of women by superiors across the North Korean military. Horrific stories from defectors have emerged, including brutal tales of physical and sexual assault and harassment, from which they have no legal recourse. Poorer women, who are often sent to work on construction brigades, are especially vulnerable to attack, as protection in these environments is even slimmer. Even if they had a recourse, most women would never report their abusers, as the risk of retaliation is simply too great. Female defectors tell stories of commanders holding women soldiers for hours after dismissal, or of a major general forcing them to undergo faux examinations under the guise of checking for malnutrition. To expose these predators for who they really are would risk a female soldier's reputation and could result in them being barred from joining the Korean Workers' Party. If that were to happen, they'd become stigmatized, and it would follow the victim around for the rest of their life. As a result, women blackmailed into silence are often forced to endure horrific acts of violence against them with no power to prevent it. And if these unions were unlucky enough to result in a pregnancy, female soldiers were apparently to blame and had to take care of the problem quickly and often painfully. Putting their own lives at risk, they do what they can to make sure no baby is carried to term. Otherwise, if they were discovered, particularly if it involved a high-up perpetrator, the military would take over the handling of the pregnancy. This led to forced, traumatizing abortions, where women would undergo the process without any access to anesthesia. Those that escaped this abuse may still not have escaped the cruel and grueling punishments. Just one person had to make a mistake for all to be punished. One defector, Jennifer Kim, talks of punishments that last all day and being forced to stand outside in the cold in her underwear or run 100 laps in full uniform. One of the most horrific she tells of, however, is when women soldiers had their hands plunged into icy water before being placed immediately on frigid cold iron bars. The freezing conditions meant their hands immediately froze to the bar, ripping off a layer of skin when removed. The horrible truth, though, is that the army still might be preferable to some women than another option for young Koreans, Kim Jong-un's Pleasure Squad. The Pleasure Squad was an entity that began long before Kim Jong-un's reign, according to defectors, first popularized by his grandfather, Kim Il-sung. Although disbanded after Kim Jong-il's death in 2011, Kim Jong-un reportedly decided to re-establish Pleasure Squads in 2015. But what are Pleasure Squads? Pleasure Squads, or Kipjumjo, are pretty much exactly as they sound. Harems of women used as puppets to demonstrate Kim Jong-un's supposed sexual prowess. These squads reportedly contain up to 2,000 women who are split into 3 groups. The first group were the Satisfaction Team for him and his top generals. The second, known as the Happiness Team, who provided massages and relaxation. And the final team, who were responsible for singing and dancing. Once Kim Jong-il inherited his position, a height measure was also introduced, given the supreme leader's own short stature, as none could or should tower over him. The Pleasure Squad girls needed to be under 165 centimeters tall. After their recruitment, the girls would be kept in the leader's mansion and brought out to entertain high-ranking officials with parties loaded on booze and sexual activity. These girls could remain in the Pleasure Squad service for up to 10 years before being released into a marriage with a North Korean military officer. When Kim Jong-un came to power, he disbanded the Pleasure Squad, as he apparently didn't trust any of the women who had been close to his father, or indeed anyone in his administration. Each was given a large sum, in North Korea, of $4,000 in hush money and various household appliances. From then, there was no Pleasure Squad. That is, until 2015, when it was reported he had restarted the tradition. Kim Jong-un continues to exploit women across North Korea in every facet of daily and military life. Though the women in uniform have proven to be strong and capable, they endure daily atrocities that no one should have to endure. The truth of Holodomor. The starvation started in the spring of '33, sometime near the end of February. The terrible starvation started because they were putting this squeeze on us. Even if someone went to get something, they'd then take it all right away. Even if someone scrounged up a handful of millet, tossed it in water and boiled it in a pot, they'd smash that pot and throw it into the yard. This is one testimony of many Ukrainians who suffered through Holodomor, the man-made famine of 1932 to 1933 that saw millions of people die due to instructions laid out by Joseph Stalin, the head of the USSR. Initially, historians argued about whether or not the famine was deliberate or an unfortunate consequence of Stalin policy. This is largely due to the fact that for years after, documentary sources were unable to include information directly from Ukraine. The information that did manage to make it to the rest of the world was on the lips of eyewitnesses or foreigners, such as journalists and diplomats who had seen the truth of Holodomor for themselves. In fact, the leading authority on Ukraine, Stanislav Kulczycki, changed his views rapidly following the decades after Holodomor, as more information came to light. Now certain it was a deliberate attack on the Ukrainian population by Joseph Stalin in an attempt to bring them to heel. While famines had already existed in Ukraine in the early 1930s, Kulczycki came to recognize the difference between these and Holodomor, referring to it as genocide, as 1932 to 1933 had a good harvest. Stalin had long since felt that the USSR relied too heavily on peasant farmers for grain acquisition and to feed the nation, and sought to end this reliance through a system called collectivism, a concept he launched in 1928 after publishing an article regarding the subject in the Pravda newspaper. Collectivism wasn't a new concept for the USSR, but Stalin definitively put it into force during his regime. Collectivism can be simply described as the removal of individual ownership of farms and property, instead assimilating it into a larger collective, stripping Ukrainian farmers of their autonomy. To further alienate and differentiate the farmers, Stalin started to once again use the word kulak in referring to them, a term that had vanished from public use some years earlier. His plan, as revealed in a speech on December 27, 1929, was threefold. Stalin intended to divide the kulaks into three categories and work to eliminate the class as a whole. The first, recognized as actively hostile, i.e. they withheld grain, were to be handed over to political police and sent to concentration camps while their families were deported. The second, the most prosperous kulak households, were to be deported, and the third group were allowed to remain but were instead given the worst land to farm. The farmers soon found their property and crops confiscated, quickly failing to meet the harsh quotas imposed by Stalin. These were just the first steps of collectivization, policies that meant grain, livestock, and property were seized, and those deported, often to places like Siberia, were packed by the thousands onto trains with no food or water. Animals and people died as Stalin established impossible to obtain quotas, leading fanatic followers in the forms of local police of the regime to seize the remaining food and water from accused kulaks, leaving them to starve. As the peasants attempted to flee Ukraine, Stalin stonewalled them, creating a blockade that prevented them from leaving famine behind, and blacklisted entire regions to prevent them from receiving any aid from in or outside of the USSR. His campaign of misinformation meant that very few outside of the Soviet Union, or indeed Ukraine itself, had little idea how truly devastating things had become. It is important, however, as both Dushnik and Graziosi acknowledge, to separate the 1933 Holodomor from earlier spontaneous famines that occurred in the Ukraine in 1930 and 31, and indeed across the whole of the USSR, the key difference being the change in human response. The earlier famine of 1932 to 33, referred to as the All-Union Famine by Kulczycki, was still caused by Soviet policy and the seizure of grain. However, it was across all USSR nations and a result of Stalin's grain appropriation, leaving peasants with nothing of their own and driving them into cities where they then died. The historian calls this a case of insufficiency, whereas Holodomor is more strictly defined as a case of absolute starvation due to USSR actions such as requisitioning all provisions and barricading peasants in their towns and villages. And so, we return to January 1933, mere days after Stalin announces his collectivism measures and plans to eliminate the kulak class. Every household was to be searched and any food provision seized, something described in multiple accounts from those who experienced it. Brigades were organized in every village that had a village council, and these brigades went around to the collective and individual farmers and took everything until nothing was left. If they found a handful of millet, they took it. If they found a handful of pumpkins, they took them. This once again highlights the key difference between Holodomor and earlier famines, where once grain was taken, now everything was under the same pretense, leaving the Ukrainians with quite literally nothing. In desperate attempts to get the sustenance any way they could, villagers often were forced to eat soup or porridge made from frozen herbs and rotting potatoes, snails, goose feet, or even just the leftover shells of sunflower seeds. With no other option, where they were not blockaded, people tried to flee to the cities in the hopes that more food would be available. But it was not just physically Ukraine that was blockaded. In these years, very little information made its way in or out of the country, with the rest of the world oblivious to the millions of people impacted and starving due to Stalin's policies. Any rumors of starvation were quickly quashed as vicious anti-Soviet propaganda and denied. The world would have been totally oblivious had it not been for the actions of the Welsh journalist Gareth Jones. In 1933, he snuck into Ukraine and returned to break the truth of what was happening there to the world. He wrote, "Everywhere was the cry, 'There is no bread, we are dying.' In the train, a communist denied to me that there was a famine. 'We are waiting for death,' was my welcome. But see, we still have our cattle fodder. Go farther south. There they have nothing. Many houses are empty of people already dead," they cried. 2 years later, Jones was dead, murdered on an assignment in China and Japan. It's long since been suspected that this was no coincidence, as in the words of David Lloyd George, Mr. Gareth Jones knew too much. But in Ukraine, little changed, as the world argued the truth of his words. In the cities, people lined up for food in lines that had no sustenance at their ends, dying where they stood in the street. Polish council in Kyiv and Kharkiv reported policemen picking up the dead and dying, sending the worst to die from lethal injection, and children who experienced daily raids from the adults in charge, leaving the young to starve. One of the worst and darkest side effects of Holodomor was the measures those still alive were forced to go through to survive, the worst of all perhaps being cannibalism. Allegedly something that was more common in rural areas, cannibalism became somewhat widespread during the Stalin-made famine, with enough eyewitness reports to corroborate the legitimacy of claims of its occurrence. This is further backed up by a 1933 August intelligence report stating prisons were full of cannibals across the cities of Ukraine. The truth is, we'll probably never know the real number of deaths due to Holodomor, thanks to the strict propaganda machine of the USSR and the banning of even the word famine. Estimates have increased as more sources have come to light, but historians place these guesses anywhere between 5 and 11 million people, a number that brings Holodomor in line with the later Nazi Holocaust. The luxury lifestyle of Saddam Hussein. On July 22, 1979, the newly instated president of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, gathered the members of Iraq's ruling Ba'athist Party for an infamous meeting. With live TV cameras rolling, he announced there were many individuals in the room suspected of plotting against him. One by one, the alleged traitors' names were called out, and one by one, they were led out to be executed, as the dictator casually puffed on his Cohiba cigar, no doubt dreaming about the priceless items he would buy and the palaces he was going to build with his newfound wealth and position. Wealth. Throughout his 25-year reign of terror, Saddam Hussein possessed an extraordinary amount of wealth that he sourced from a variety of places. In 1991, it was estimated that over the previous decade, he had skimmed at least $10 billion from oil sales, which was his main revenue stream. However, because of international sanctions to stash his cash, Hussein had to get creative. In order to prevent his assets from being seized, he redirected much of his fortune into foreign bank accounts with the help of his half-brother and ambassador to Switzerland, Barzan al-Takriti. He also invested heavily in international companies, such as the French conglomerate Lagardère, where he had $90 million worth of shares, and he even kept a portion of his riches in U.S. Treasury government bonds. By taking such precautions, Saddam Hussein was able to avoid the brunt of financial penalties imposed on Iraq by other countries during the 1990s and early 2000s. In fact, they were so effective that the Iraqi despot's net worth only went up in this time period. In 1997, Forbes magazine reported that he was worth at least $5 billion, the 59th richest person in the world. 3 years later, Saddam's wealth had actually increased to at least $7 billion. By 2003, following the outbreak of the Iraq War against the United States, more effective and serious measures had reduced this to a measly $2 billion. Expensive tastes. A man of peasant origins, as soon as Saddam Hussein became leader, his wants and desires got a lot more expensive. A despot who liked to look sharp, Hussein frequented one of Baghdad's most exclusive tailors, Harut, at least once a week, and was known to order several of their top-of-the-line suits at the same time. Similarly, he also used his endless bank account to hoover up convoys of luxury cars, including air-conditioned Mercedes limousines, which he bought from Kuwait every year. When he wasn't purchasing cars, Saddam Hussein was perfectly happy with destroying them to make a point. Whilst in captivity at the end of his life, he would recount to his American guards how he once doused with gasoline and burned his son Uday's entire fleet of Rolls-Royces, Bentleys, BMWs, Porsches, and Ferraris. The punishment was a reaction to Uday drunkenly shooting and killing 3 people at a party with a pump-action shotgun after an argument. You know, the usual. Like most of the filthy rich, his adoration for cars was matched by his fondness for mega yachts. The grandest was the Al Mansour, a yacht more akin to a cruise ship that had marble and gold-plated rooms, a 200-seat dining room, a helipad, a mini submarine escape pod, and if the rumors are true, 2 9K-31 Strela 1 SAM launchers hidden in the structure of the vessel. Combined with his other 2 private yachts, the weight of his humble fleet was heavier than the entire Iraqi Navy put together. Amazingly, to this day, the Al Mansour, which Saddam never actually boarded, still survives, albeit as a rusting wreckage in southern Iraq, now used by local fishermen as a picnic spot. In addition to vehicles and boats, Saddam also boasted an extensive collection of art. Rather surprisingly, the walls of his private quarters were plastered with images of ripped men and shapely female beauties doing battle with snakes, dragons, and stone demons. This was because, to everyone's shock, the dictator's favorite artist was Rowena Morrill, an American painter who specialized in erotic fantasy scenes. On the dinner table, Saddam's appetites were a lot more conventional. He quickly developed a liking for American food that was a far cry from the diet of rice and beans that he had grown up with. In particular, he loved barbecues and chowing down on such delectable treats as spare ribs, which he washed down with his favorite drink, Portuguese Mateus rose wine, or Johnny Walker Black Label whiskey. Moreover, fresh food was flown to him twice a week, and his meals were always prepared by European chefs after it had been examined and x-rayed for poison. He also had a penchant for barbecued pheasant, which he served to his family and friends at informal alfresco picnics, and which he had often shot himself during one of his weekly hunting trips to the Iraqi countryside. Equally, though, these excursions could also lead to the shooting of his high-ranking officials, who often signed their own death warrants by unintentionally revealing ideological differences in the casual and relaxed atmosphere. Alternatively, if he fancied dining out, Hussein went to some of Baghdad's finest restaurants, such as Dananir and Matam al-Matam, after a hard day's dictatoring. Above all, his favorite establishment was the Nadi al-Said Club, which translates to the Hunting Club, and which was located in the fanciest district of the city. Replete with a comfortable clubhouse, a swimming pool, tennis court, and horse riding facilities, Hussein invested so heavily in its refurbishment that he could often be found there inspecting building progress. During these visits, he was reportedly accompanied by at least 8 armed men, with 2 either side of him and 4 behind him. Palaces. As soon as Saddam Hussein became the top dog, he seized large swaths of land across the country for an ambitious and unprecedented personal building program. The autocrat's favorite place to build was the scenic city of Tikrit, where the livelihoods of many ordinary Iraqis were completely destroyed as a result of impromptu seizures. In time, Tikrit became known as the City of Palaces because of the dozens upon dozens of lofty mansions that line the picturesque banks of the Tigris River. Altogether, this sprawling complex, which also included personal palaces for his mother and sons, formed an area that was 50 times bigger than the White House. It's been estimated that throughout his entire presidency, while much of his malnourished population starved, Hussein constructed no less than 48 luxury palaces at a cost of $2.2 billion. Each of them were so vast they boggled the mind. To take one example, Saddam's Al-Faw Palace had a total of 62 rooms that included 29 bathrooms. In addition to being storage facilities for weapons of mass destruction, they were also decked out with a bunker and a network of underground tunnels, in case emergency action was necessary. A paranoid ruler, Hussein regularly moved from palace to palace to hide his whereabouts from would-be assassins. Squadrons of highly trained Republican Guard soldiers patrolled each of these fairy tale residences, which featured lush gardens, man-made lakes filled with fish, intricately designed waterfalls, and artillery-resistant walls. The insides were just as lavish, containing carvings made from rare wood. Enormous crystal chandeliers, gold plumbing fixtures, silk Persian carpets, and priceless Louis XVI-inspired furniture. Even if it was unnecessary and pointless, no expense was spared. For instance, at the presidential palace in Baghdad, Saddam demanded that each wing have a swimming pool, even though he couldn't swim. And in each of his enormous homes, he insisted on having an ornate throne which he could sit on to greet visitors. In fact, he was so vainly obsessed with his interiors that in the middle of an economic crisis, he was still importing blue marble from Argentina at a cost of $4,000 per square meter. But Saddam Hussein didn't just indulge himself in the art of palace building. In 1999, for his birthday celebrations, he authorized the construction of a lakeside resort city called Saddamiyat al-Tartar, situated 85 miles west of Baghdad, that cost hundreds of millions of dollars. It features stadiums, an amusement park, hospitals, parks, as well as 625 plush villas that were exclusively used by his henchmen. A man with more money than sense and compassion. As Saddam Hussein was led to his execution, all that was left of the man who had once been worth billions of dollars remained in his cell. A pile of clothes, some paper and water bottles, and a box of his signature Cohiba cigars.
Throwing people from helicopters. Pinochet's reign of terror over Chile. Augusto Pinochet became president of Chile on the 11th of September 1973, when, with the support of the U.S. government, he successfully overthrew the country's democratically elected president, Salvador Allende. What followed was nearly a 17-year-long attack on Chilean human rights, democracy, and way of life that still reverberates in the country to this day. It is not known where all his victims' bodies are buried, both metaphorically and literally, as the true depths of Pinochet's political regime of terror only began to be revealed after several enlightening reports were published in the early 2000s. Who was Augusto Pinochet? Before his rise to power, Augusto Pinochet was a career soldier, born on the 25th of November 1915, in the port city of Valparaiso. He worked his way through the ranks to become the youngest student of 1948 to enter the Academy of War at just 32 years old. From there, his career took him from Chile to Ecuador and back again, as he spent the next few decades rising to the rank of Major General and even escorting Cuban revolutionary leader Fidel Castro during his trip to Chile in 1971. By January of the next year, he had become the Army's commander-in-chief, leaving him perfectly positioned for what was to come next: the coup. In the last 2 decades, declassified files have revealed the extent of the CIA's involvement in the Chilean coup, including nurturing the country's political climate to a place where a coup would be accepted, destabilization of President Allende's rule, and on-the-ground support in the case of potential failure. With an already weakened government and almost complete loss of control of the armed forces, one of the prime catalyst moments for the coup was when the commander-in-chief of the army, Carlos Prats, resigned and was replaced with someone Allende thought he could trust, General Augusto Pinochet. On September 11, 1973, the armed forces were ordered to surround major cities and areas with the potential for resistance and cutting off communications with a clear message: they would not be afraid to kill those who defied them. Allende, despite knowing the likely outcome of the situation, refused to flee. He died in the presidential palace, and although official records claim his death was suicide using a rifle gifted to him by Castro, plenty of other evidence points to his murder by Pinochet's henchmen. Despite minimal opposition, the days following the coup were so bloodthirsty, it's unknown how many people actually died, as estimates varied from 2,000 to 10,000 casualties. One thing, however, was clear. The coup wasn't targeted just at political leaders, but anyone Pinochet and the armed forces saw as a potential threat, and even those that they didn't. Working-class people experienced bombings, roundups by the armed forces, and large-scale raids and imprisonments. Political prisoners suffered torture and brutality before their eventual murder. Some of the more shocking reports detail instances of severe beatings, psychological torture, hanging prisoners by their arms for long periods, suffocation, severe degradation, and assault, among many other horrific atrocities. After the coup was over, the new leader, Pinochet, told the press that he was only elected as the first military head due to his age, and that each armed forces chief would have their turn. The reality was that he would do anything to stop that from happening, including the murder and torture of anyone who opposed him. Pinochet's reign of terror really grew in intensity less than a month later. The Caravan of Death. On October 15, 1973, he sanctioned a series of targeted, brutal attacks that left a trail of death in their wake. He looked to General Sergio Arellano Stark, another coup leader, to spearhead the so-called Caravan of Death, claiming he was simply streamlining the justice system for political prisoners and regional representatives of the old Allende government. In other words, anyone from police chiefs to trade unionists and civic leaders were targeted and found themselves suddenly acquainted with Pinochet's newly formed death squads and marked as political dissidents. The Caravan of Death traveled via Puma helicopter to the major Chilean cities of La Serena, Copiapó, Antofagasta, and Calama, leaving a trail of 68 deaths in their wake in just over 4 days. Most of its victims were political opponents that had actually turned themselves in to the new Chilean government, only to be immediately beaten and interrogated once incarcerated. Most bodies were later found in common graves. However, 14 were never recovered, and it's possible they became some of the first to be thrown from the helicopters into the ocean, as it was later reported occurred during Pinochet's regime. These mass executions were a statement by Pinochet on how he intended to run Chile and attack non-violent opposition and even civilian supporters of the old government. After the caravan's initial run, General Stark and other members of the death squad formed Pinochet's new Chilean secret police agency, the DINA, or National Intelligence Directorate, on June 14, 1974. Not unlike Nazi Germany's Gestapo, the members of the DINA would commit atrocities under the banner of the new law, continuing to kill and repress any potential opposition. By the end of the year, it was estimated there were over 700 agents of the DINA operating across Chile. Those detained would be shipped to prison and concentration camps, where conditions were appalling enough without the horrendous acts of prolonged torture that these victims had to endure. Pinochet's arrest. Despite his brutal tactics for remaining in power, Pinochet lost a 1988 mandated election, eventually retiring the presidency in 1990. When he stepped down, he became a senator for life. But despite all his attempts to remain untouchable, he was finally arrested in the UK in 1998 at the age of 83. In an unprecedented move against the still powerful Pinochet, Spanish authorities pushed for his extradition, and subsequently countries like the United States were pressured to release classified documents about their involvement in his regime. Among the atrocities discovered was the fate of Chilean nationals who had disappeared during Pinochet's tenure, revealing information on some of the infamous death flights that occurred across Chile and other Latin American countries in the 70s and 80s. Death flights and the Rettig Report. In 1991, the Rettig Report was released, an in-depth inquiry into the human rights abuses that occurred under Pinochet's dictatorship. In it, multiple victims of Chile's death flights are identified. These flights largely took place in Puma helicopters and were responsible for rounding up anyone they saw opposing Pinochet, ultimately drugging them and throwing them into the ocean. Tragically, this meant many people never learned the fate of their loved ones, nor were able to seek closure through the return of the bodies. Across the Rettig Report, multiple specific incidents of death flights or the use of helicopters in the removal of citizens were mentioned, the first of which was on September 25, 1973, just 14 days after Pinochet seized power. Ricardo Bustos Martinez, a 21-year-old civilian with no political ties, was arrested, beaten, and put into a helicopter. He was never seen again. Later, on October 11th of the same year, a teacher and member of the Radical Party named Luis Barrientos was arrested and put onto a helicopter. His body was found at the mouth of the Imperial River, making it extremely likely that he was actually murdered on the helicopter and then just thrown out of it. Other reports within the document reveal similar horrendous acts of violence. A former communist official, Humberto Rodriguez, was literally gutted with a knife before being thrown into the ocean. In another instance, another Communist Party leader, along with other drugged prisoners, was thrown into the ocean after being sliced open sometime around October 20th. In 2001, more of Pinochet's crimes came to light. Under the new Chilean president, Ricardo Lagos, further investigations uncovered the fate of 120 missing detainees who were tossed from helicopters during his regime. In the same year, retired Colonel Oglenier Benavente also revealed the part that Pinochet's personal pilot, Brigadier Antonio Palomo Contreras, played in the death flights, claiming that he frequently made bodies disappear using his helicopter, saying, "Some were dropped into the ocean, others were thrown on the high peaks of the Andes." But despite Pinochet's arrest, he never truly faced any consequences for his numerous crimes against humanity. He was returned to Chile on medical grounds in 2000, and the Chilean Supreme Court dropped prosecution charges against him in 2002. He resigned his seat as senator for life that same year, aged 87. And passed away on the 10th of December 2006. Having lived the long life he had denied so many others.
Idi Amin. Known as Big Daddy by his supporters and the Butcher by his critics, Idi Amin went from being a dirt poor boy from a town in northwest Uganda, so remote nobody knows its name, to becoming the third president of Uganda and a speaker on the global political stage. He was infamous for his ruthless stomping down of perceived traitors, expulsion of non-Africans, his widespread terror, and his taking joy in humiliation. Idi Amin's exact birth date is uncertain, with historians estimating anywhere between 1925 and 1928 as the true date. When Amin was born, his parents split, and it's believed he was largely raised by his mother, although he still saw his father infrequently. He grew up in the West Nile province among the Kakwa people, a small Islamic tribe who had settled in the region just a few decades prior. As a child and into his teen years, it's reported that he received little education due to limited opportunities for West Nile Ugandans, and by 21 he had few options on what to do next. Rather than attempt to cobble together more of an education, he joined the former British regiment, the King's African Rifles, and began the training that would come to define his future rule. Allegedly beginning his career as an assistant cook, he quickly rose through the ranks, taking promotion after promotion on his rise to the top. He was deployed to Somalia in 1949, helped put down the Shifta rebels, and was deployed again to snuff out the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya. Along with being a skilled soldier, he was also quickly gaining a reputation for his cruelty. Amin showed so much unnecessary brutality during interrogations that it almost derailed his military career, but instead he was promoted to Effendi in 1959, the highest possible rank for a black African soldier in the British military. In addition to his military prowess at the KAR, Amin was also a skilled boxer, becoming a renowned Ugandan amateur boxing champion. His physical prowess and affinity for conflict spanned across his professional and personal life. Uganda was pushing towards independence as the 1950s came to a close, and Amin made a key alliance with Apollo Milton Obote, the leader of the Uganda People's Conference. Obote would go on to become the Prime Minister of Uganda when it reached independence in 1962. Amin was made a lieutenant in Obote's Ugandan army. His first order for Amin was to stop the cattle stealing in the north. Amin did this, but he also committed such atrocities that the British demanded he be tried for his crimes. Instead, Obote had him trained further in military tactics in the United Kingdom. When Amin got back to Uganda in 1964, the army was in full-scale mutiny, without anyone to hold control in his absence. Amin was tasked with getting it back in order. When he succeeded, he was promoted again, this time to deputy commander. He was then accused of smuggling gold, coffee, and ivory out of the Congo alongside Prime Minister Obote. Meanwhile, in 1966, Obote dismissed the government, declaring himself president. The allure of power drove Amin's ambitions higher and higher. He continued to hoard funds from smuggling and illicit arms dealing with Sudanese rebels, all the while fortifying his position in the Ugandan military. Obote promoted Amin to Chief of the Army and Air Force, a position that's forfeited even more power to Amin. After an unsuccessful assassination attempt on Obote's life in 1969, the president became more wary and tried to seize greater control of the military in 1970. All the while, Amin continued to build his network, working closely with Israeli and British agents in Uganda. Mistrusting of Amin, Obote attempted to demote him, but this too failed. While Obote was traveling to Singapore, Amin took advantage. In 1971, he staged a successful coup on the Ugandan government. While he called himself president, the title he preferred was, quote, His Excellency President for Life Field Marshal Al-Haji Dr. Idi Amin, VC DSO MC, Lord of all the beasts of the earth and fishes of the sea, and conqueror of the British Empire in Africa in general and Uganda in particular, end quote. Amin immediately got started with his atrocities. In his first few months, he brutally assassinated political threats and members of the Ugandan police before turning his attention on the public. Quickly, he disposed of the Chief of Justice, the Anglican Archbishop and the Vice Chancellor of Mekere University, among other high-ranking officials. Within just 3 months, he also enlisted 10,000 new soldiers, almost half of which were ex-Anyanya guerrilla fighters, former Zairean freedom fighters, and those from Amin's home. In the first 6 months of his reign, Ugandans killed Ugandans with increasing alacrity, urged by Amin himself. From there, he then launched one of his first major attacks on humanity since taking over, the killing of approximately 3,000 Langi and Acholi soldiers, given their connection to the now exiled former Prime Minister Obote. He also created killer squads within what was called the State Research Bureau and Public Safety Unit to hunt down Obote's supporters and task them with snuffing out any opposition to his reign. Obote, from his exile in Tanzania, attempted to rally his followers to retake Uganda, but was unsuccessful. Tens of thousands of Asian residents were expelled from his country in 1972, which thoroughly wrecked the Ugandan economy to a point that its impact is still felt today. He publicly insulted the leaders of the free world, including the United States and Great Britain, and reversed Uganda's relations with Israel, instead buddying up with Colonel Muammar Mohammed al-Gaddafi of Libya, as well as the Soviet Union and the Palestinians. Despite this and public hostility from leaders in the US, UK, and Israel, they still hypocritically worked with the dictator. In 1973, America actually took over Britain as Uganda's most prominent trading partner, despite publicly closing their embassy in Kampala that same year. Amin continued to act brutally and with abandon. In 1976, a group of Palestinians and members of the Badr Meinhof gang hijacked a French airliner at Entebbe Airport. With both Amin and the Ugandan army's support, the flight en route from Israel to France was held hostage by the two groups. However, Israeli forces launched an immediate counter-raid and freed the hostages. This sent Amin into a tirade. He executed several airport employees, a host of Kenyans that he blamed for the counter-raid, and an elderly British passenger who had been sent to a hospital after the attempted hijacking. By this point, Amin received his nickname, the Butcher of Uganda, and he lived up to that moniker. He had killed over 300,000 civilians, including some high-ranking Uganda citizens such as the Anglican Archbishop, the governor of the Bank of Uganda, and the chancellor of Makerere College. Yet he grew more paranoid over time, and it was clear that his grip was slipping. When a collection of Ugandans fled over the border to Tanzania, he flew into a rage and accused Tanzanian President Julius Nyerere of attempting to foment insurrection in Uganda. In typical Amin fashion, he immediately turned to military action in an attempt to enact his revenge. He sent a mixture of Ugandan military and Libyan support into Tanzania, aiming to punish Nyerere as well as those that had deserted. His goal was to take Kagera Salient, a small territory north of the Kagera River. While he initially took the strip of land, it didn't last long. Just 2 weeks later, Nyerere launched a counterattack with the help of Ugandan rebels. The momentum quickly went against Amin as the rebels and Tanzanians took Kampala. Amin's military was driven back to the capital, and when it became clear he wasn't going to win, Amin fled the country, leaving the Ugandan rebels to put Yusufu Lule into the role of president, effectively ending Amin's bloody reign of terror. Amin's retreat took him to Libya, where he stayed for a decade under the care of al-Gaddafi before he moved on to Saudi Arabia. There he lived out the rest of his days until he died in 2003, never held accountable for the crimes he committed. Life under the Khmer Rouge, Pol Pot, Famine, and S-21, 1975 to 1979. When the Vietnamese army captured Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia, from the Khmer Rouge in 1979, they found the city in a terrible state, and among the horrors they came across was a former high school that had been turned into a prison and was known as Security Prison 21, or just S-21. The dark buildings were enclosed in electrified barbed wire, and iron bars covered all the windows. The prisoners included academics, doctors, monks, students, and their teachers, as well as factory workers and engineers. All were accused of being enemies of the regime and tortured and forced to name their friends and family members as co-conspirators. Whole families were often brought in together to be interrogated and executed. Ultimately, paranoia meant that the regime began to turn on itself, and the cells were soon filled with party activists and their families, and even high-ranking politicians. At least 18,145 people had been imprisoned there, and all but a handful had been executed. S-21 was only one of more than 150 torture and execution centers established by the Khmer Rouge. Today, it stands as a memorial to the lives lost and to the brutality that they inflicted upon the people of Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge was the name given to the members of the Communist Party of Kampuchea, the CPK, who ruled Cambodia between 1975 and 1979. They were led by the infamous Pol Pot, who attempted to purify Cambodian society along racial, social, and political lines. This led to one of the worst cases of genocide in history. Influenced by Chairman Mao's Great Leap Forward in China, Pol Pot imagined his own super Great Leap Forward in Cambodia. After seizing power in a civil war in 1975, the CPK wanted to rapidly build the country under their own vision. Pol Pot compared the Cambodian revolution with those in China, Korea, and Vietnam, and proclaimed that no revolution would be as fast as his. Indeed, the CPK was obsessed with speed, and many in the party were paranoid that they would be replaced, and believed the faster their plans could be achieved, the safer they would be. The Super Great Leap was to be achieved independent of any foreign aid, through independent self-mastery. Khmer Rouge theorists believe that an initial period of self-imposed economic isolation would stimulate the rebirth of the crafts and the country's industrial capability. In order to follow this policy of extreme self-reliance, the CPK announced a 4-year plan to triple the country's rice production. However, Cambodia had suffered severely during the Civil War. Almost 3/4 of the draft animals needed to plow the fields had been killed, and by 1975, rice production had dropped by 84%. Such a rapid increase in production was impossible, but Pol Pot believed this was merely a matter of revolutionary willpower and instituted his policy of agricultural offenses, including a nationwide system of forced labor. He believed that achieving his economic goals would be as simple as winning the Civil War. The army and the CPK's agricultural warfare were the people, and manual labor was the key to victory. The purpose of every Cambodian was to work and advance the revolution. Villages were reorganized into cooperatives, and thousands of city dwellers were forced out of their homes to work on the farms. As a result of this policy, workers of all ages were forced to do 10 to 14 hours of hard labor per day in unsustainable conditions. Often, survivors reported working late into the night, particularly during harvest time, surrounded by encouraging slogans urging them to pledge to sacrifice your life to accomplish Angar's work, or to stay on the worksite until death. A lot of food was needed to feed all these productive farmers. However, rice was also needed for Pol Pot's economic goals, so large amounts of rice were extracted from the population for party use and export. The CPK provided nothing in return. Fareth, one survivor of the period, recalled that she was assigned to a children's work unit when she was 11 years old. Fareth was ordered to carry soil, dig trenches, and help build a local dam. She and her unit lived at the work site, sleeping under a rough shelter made out of palm leaves. The dam was considered a highly important project for the revolution, and her unit were given a comparatively extravagant food ration of 2 daily portions of rice and salt and sometimes fish soup. Still, Fareth was constantly hungry and exhausted, as even such plentiful rations were not sufficient to sustain such hard labor. When her unit had finished at the worksite 3 months later, the local officials held a celebration to commemorate the occasion. The celebration included a play, revolutionary songs, and a mass marriage ceremony. The young Fareth says she was personally praised for her hard work and felt so proud of herself. It was only later that Fareth learned about what happened to her 2 younger sisters during this time. Her grandmother had been placed in charge of them because she was too old to work. She was starving and grew too weak to look after the girls. Without someone to care for them, the little girls were so hungry that they became ill and died of starvation. Meanwhile, absolute socialism meant that all natural resources were the property of the state, and any signs of individualism or privatism were banned, including private gardens, private ownership of foodstuffs, and even the act of cooking privately, which was punishable by imprisonment and execution. The people were not even allowed to forage for food in the countryside. After Fareth's little sisters had died, her grandmother survived on a small amount of hidden medicine. However, the Khmer Rouge searched the village every 3 days, looking for so-called contraband, including cooking equipment and rice. The small stash of medicine was found and confiscated, along with the family's only cooking pot, by local Khmer Rouge cadres. Fareth's grandmother refused to suffer this final indignity, and within a week she succumbed to a combination of illness and starvation and passed away. Although the situation rapidly deteriorated into a full-blown famine, Pol Pot continued to talk about agriculture as a military operation, and he saw enemies everywhere. In his mind, any shortfalls in production were the fault of saboteurs and ideological enemies. Anybody who criticized the CPK's policies was branded an enemy of the state and was arrested, tortured, and executed. While the farmers starved, the CPK continued to make thousands of arrests with those who it believed to be enemies or a threat to the state. Many experienced doctors were executed or hid their profession because any sign of a privileged or urban background, including education or professional training, were viewed with extreme suspicion by the Khmer Rouge and created a high risk of execution if discovered. Indeed, this led to a lack of medicine and healthcare at a time when many of the nation's workers were sickly and starving. Instead of seeking a solution, the Khmer Rouge mocked its victims. The suspicious CPK accused overworked and underfed workers of feigning illness to avoid work, saying those that were starving had caught an imaginary disease. CPK slogans said that we must wipe out all those who imagine they are ill and expel them from our society. There was no respite for the exhausted, starving, and sickly population, and many victims simply just gave up and collapsed and died. Utilizing its secret police, the Khmer Rouge rounded up, tortured, and executed anybody who was seen as an enemy. This also included all foreigners and ethnic minorities, those with connections to the previous Cambodian government, professionals and intellectuals, including anybody who had an education or understood a foreign language, and party members who had fallen foul of the regime. Innocent men, women, and children, even newborn babies, were brought to prisons like S-21 and coerced into confessing for imaginary crimes and providing the names of other alleged enemies of the state. For 12 days and nights, an engineer called Umar was tortured at S-21. His tormentors whipped him with bamboo sticks and broke his fingers when he tried to shield himself. They shackled his legs and removed his toenails with pliers. Umar was also subjected to electric shocks, which he feared the most. Electrodes were placed inside of his ears and the shocks deafened him. He said that he felt as though his eyes were on fire and he was ready to tell them everything they wanted to hear. The interrogators forced him to sign a false confession that he was working for the CIA and had recruited other men and women. The dozens of innocent acquaintances that he had named were also arrested, tortured, and murdered. Umar had never heard of the CIA and never found out why he had been arrested. He was one of the few who actually survived their stay at S-21. Most foreigners had left the country before the end of the Civil War, but several were imprisoned at S-21, including the 26-year-old British teacher, John Dawson DeWorst. John was traveling the hippie trail to visit his friend in Malaysia when he met the owners of a small yacht, a Canadian, Stuart Glass, and a New Zealander, Kerry Hamill. They decided to sail north along the Thai coast toward Bangkok, when somehow the three men found themselves in Cambodian waters and their boat was seized by a revolutionary patrol boat. Stuart was shot dead immediately, while John and Kerry were taken to the infamous Tuol Sleng prison in Phnom Penh. The men were undoubtedly tortured, and records show that John had written a confession that mixed the true events of his life with false accounts about his life as a CIA agent. After confessing, most inmates were brought to one of several sites known as the Killing Fields. In the 4 years of the CPK's rule, more than 1 million people were executed and buried in mass graves at these places. Khmer Rouge soldiers, young men or women usually taken from peasant families, would then execute their victims using brutal and horrific methods, such as poison or literally beating them to death. In some cases, they even made their victims dig their own graves first as a final insult. To this day, their remains are still being uncovered at the Killing Fields. Starvation and executions under the Khmer Rouge were responsible for around 1.5 to 2 million deaths, nearly a quarter of Cambodia's population at that time. After the Vietnamese seized Phnom Penh in 1979, Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge fled into Thailand to wage a guerrilla war. Support for the CPK gradually waned and the Khmer Rouge became less powerful and disbanded. Pol Pot died of a heart attack in 1998. In the final interview before his death, he said that his conscience was clear and everything he had done for his country.